It didn't roar like other machines of war. It whispered through the sky. Radar couldn't find it. Pilots couldn't outrun it. And the men who built it were ordered to disappear it before the world ever saw what they had created. One prototype survived, locked away, hidden in silence for decades. And what it revealed changed everything we thought we knew about modern aviation. The question is, why did they hide it? And more importantly, what else are they still hiding? Welcome, welcome, welcome to WW2 Ghost Wings, the channel where history's most buried secrets finally get to breathe again. Now listen. If you are new here, and this is your first time visiting us, think of this channel like your grandfather's oldest, dustiest drawer. The one nobody was allowed to open. We open it every single time. And to our friends who have been here before, welcome back, soldiers. You already know what we do here. Now, a small request. A very humble request. If you are watching this and you are somewhere above 50 years of age, you have lived through enough of history to know that the most important stories are always the ones they tried hardest to erase. So do us one favor, the same favor you'd do for an old friend. Press that subscribe button. Don't let these stories get buried again. Your click keeps the history alive. And if you are younger, well, subscribe too, because one day you'll be the one telling these stories to your grandchildren. Also, drop a comment right now and tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it is London, Lahore, Lagos, or somewhere in between, we want to know. This community stretches across every time zone, and that is something truly remarkable. By the year 1943, something had shifted in the skies over Europe. Germany's air dominance, that terrifying. Mechanical confidence that had defined the early years of World War II was beginning to crack. The Allied bombing campaigns were intensifying. American B-17 flying fortresses were crossing into German airspace in enormous formations. And German fighter pilots, no matter how skilled, could no longer stop them with conventional aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force on the planet, was bleeding. Hitler's generals knew the truth, even if they refused to say it loudly. Germany was losing the air war. And losing the air war meant losing everything. It was inside this atmosphere of quiet desperation that a very small, very secretive group of engineers received an extraordinary mandate. They were not asked to improve existing aircraft. They were not asked to make faster versions of machines already flying. They were asked to do something far more dangerous. They were asked to start over entirely. The German Air Ministry issued what became known as the 3x1000 requirement. It was simple on paper, but almost impossible in reality. They needed an aircraft that could carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs, travel 1,000 kilometers per hour, and maintain a combat range of 1,000 kilometers. No aircraft on Earth could do all three things at once, not in 1943. But two brothers in a quiet workshop believed they could. Walter and Reimar Horten had been obsessed with a single radical idea since their teenage years, the flying wing. No tail, no fuselage. Just one pure, seamless shape cutting through air with almost no resistance. They had been experimenting with gliders built on this principle for years. And now, finally, the war had made Germany desperate enough to listen to them. What emerged from their workshop was not just an aircraft. 'Twas a vision of the future wrapped in wood, steel, and jet engines. A shape so unusual, so aerodynamically aggressive, that even experienced Luftwaffe officers who saw it for the first time fell silent. They called it the Horten Ho 229. It looked like nothing that had ever flown before. And when they ran early tests on its radar signature, the results were so alarming, so strategically significant, that senior officers immediately understood one thing. This aircraft could never be allowed to fall into enemy hands, and that decision would trigger one of the most carefully organized cover-ups in the entire history of modern warfare. Imagine standing on a frozen German airfield in the winter of 1944. The wind is cutting. The sky is gray. And then, something moves at the far end of the runway. It has no nose, no tail, no body. It is simply a wing. A giant, dark, silent wing. And before anyone can fully process what they are seeing, it accelerates, lifts, and vanishes into the clouds above. The engineers watching from the ground do not cheer. They do not celebrate. They simply look at each other and say nothing, because they already understand what the rest of the world does not yet know. They have just watched the future take flight. The Horten Ho 229 was not designed the way other wartime aircraft were designed. Most aircraft of that era followed a simple, proven logic: a long body, two wings attached to the sides, a tail at the back for control and stability. Engineers understood this formula. Factories could build it. Pilots could fly it. The Horten brothers rejected all of it. Their flying wing design eliminated the fuselage entirely. The aircraft was the wing. Every component, the cockpit, the engines, the fuel, the weapons, was buried inside a single continuous shape. And that shape was not chosen randomly. It was mathematically engineered to do one thing above everything else: to cheat the air itself. Traditional aircraft fight against aerodynamic drag with every meter they fly. The Ho 229 did not fight the air. It slid through it. Wind tunnel testing showed drag reduction figures that left German aerodynamicists visibly shaken. At the speeds this aircraft was capable of reaching, approaching 900 kilometers per hour, conventional fighters would simply be left behind, unable to respond, unable to intercept. But speed was only the beginning of the story. What truly alarmed and fascinated the engineers working on this program was something they had not entirely planned for. When early radar tests were conducted against a wooden scale model of the Ho 229, results produced a silence in the room that lasted several uncomfortable seconds. The aircraft was nearly invisible to radar. Not completely, not by modern stealth standards, but compared to every other aircraft flying in 1944. Its radar cross-section was reduced by a margin that should not have been possible with the technology of that era. The carbon-impregnated plywood skin of the airframe, chosen originally for weight reduction, was absorbing radar waves rather than reflecting them back. The Horten brothers may not have fully understood why it worked, but they understood that it worked. Northrop Grumman, one of America's most sophisticated defense contractors, conducted a formal classified study on the Ho 229 decades later. Their engineers built a full-scale replica and subjected it to modern radar testing. Their conclusion was precise and deeply unsettling. Had the Ho 229 entered operational service in early 1945, Allied radar installations along the English coast would have had approximately 2 minutes of warning before it reached them. 2 minutes. At that speed, with that payload, against radar systems that were never designed to track something that thin, that fast, that quiet. The aircraft also carried two Mk-108, 30mm cannons, weapons capable of destroying a heavy bomber with a single burst. It could climb faster than almost any Allied fighter. It could disengage from combat before an enemy pilot had time to properly identify what he was even looking at. It was not simply a better aircraft. It was a different category of weapon entirely. And yet, for all its terrifying capability, fewer than 3 were ever completed. No full operational squadron was ever formed. No Allied bomber formation ever encountered one in the skies over Europe. The question that historians and military analysts have asked ever since is not how it was built. The question is far more disturbing than that. The question is, what would have happened if they had built it 2 years earlier? And the answer to that question, something that certain governments, to this day, would rather not discuss openly. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in the final days of a collapsing empire. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of erasure, of fires burning in locked rooms. of trucks moving through the dark on roads that appear on no official map, of engineers being handed one final order not to build something, but to make sure certain things never existed at all. It was the spring of 1945. The Allied forces were closing in from both sides. From the west, American and British troops were crossing the Rhine. From the east, Soviet armies were pushing through with terrifying momentum. Berlin was burning. The war had perhaps weeks remaining. And inside a network of carefully hidden German facilities, a very different kind of operation was quietly reaching its final phase. It was not a military operation. There were no battles being planned, no defensive lines being drawn. This operation had only one objective: destruction of evidence. Senior Luftwaffe commanders and SS intelligence officers had known for months that Germany could not win. And in that knowledge, they had made a calculated decision. If the technology they had developed could not win the war for Germany, then it must absolutely not be allowed to win the next war against Germany. More specifically, it must not fall into Soviet hands. The order went out quietly, through channels that left no written trace. Blueprints were to be burned. Prototype components were to be scattered across multiple locations. Engineers working on the most sensitive programs were to be relocated, reassigned, or in the darkest cases, silenced permanently. The Horten workshop in Göttingen was one of the first facilities to receive these orders. What happened there in those final weeks has never been fully reconstructed by historians. The paper trail simply stops. Reimar Horten himself later described burning documents personally, though he was always carefully vague about precisely which documents, and precisely how many. Walter Horten's account differed from his brother's in ways that historians found suspicious rather than coincidental. What is known with certainty is this: when American soldiers from the Exploitation Division of the U.S. Army finally reached the Horten facility, they found one incomplete airframe, scattered components, and a workshop that had clearly been deliberately and professionally stripped. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had been very well prepared. But the Americans were not the only ones searching. Soviet intelligence units operating under a program that would later feed directly into early Illytsky Russian jet development were simultaneously racing through the same region, following the same intelligence leads, arriving sometimes only hours behind their American counterparts. This race, quiet, unacknowledged, and extraordinarily dangerous, became one of the most significant hidden competitions of the entire post-war period. It was inside this chaos that the United States launched what history now knows as Operation Paperclip. The name sounds almost casual. It's almost administrative. It was neither. Operation Paperclip was a systematic government-authorized program to identify, extract, and recruit Germany's most valuable scientific and engineering minds before the Soviets could reach them first. Over 1,600 German scientists and engineers were ultimately brought to the United States under this program. Many of them carried knowledge that had never been written down anywhere, knowledge that existed only inside their memories. Among those whose expertise was quietly absorbed into American defense programs were individuals with direct connections to the flying wing research that the Hortens had pioneered. The most extraordinary recovered artifact of the entire program was a single, incomplete Ho 229 airframe today, housed at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's restoration facility in Suitland, Maryland. It sits there still, incomplete, partially disassembled, a ghost of a machine that almost changed history. And when researchers and defense analysts stand beside it today, they do not see a relic. They see a warning about how quickly the future can be hidden, how efficiently genius can be buried, and how the most dangerous weapons are sometimes not the ones that were used, but the ones that were almost used, and then made to disappear. History has a strange habit. The things it buries the deepest always find their way back to the surface, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way a shadow returns at dusk, without asking permission, without announcing itself. It simply appears. The war ended in May of 1945. The guns fell silent. The factories stopped. The uniforms were folded away. And the world began the long, exhausting work of rebuilding what 6 years of total war had destroyed. But inside certain locked rooms in Washington, inside certain unmarked offices at emerging American defense contractors, inside the quiet minds of German engineers now living under new names in new countries, the war had not entirely ended. It had simply changed address. For decades after World War II, the United States Air Force pursued conventional aircraft development, faster jets, higher altitudes, more powerful engines. The arms race with the Soviet Union drove everything forward at extraordinary speed. And yet, for all that furious progress, something kept returning to the drawing boards of America's most secretive aviation designers. A shape. A specific, radical, deeply familiar shape. No tail, no fusile. Just one continuous, seamless wing, cutting through air with almost no resistance, leaving almost no radar signature behind. In 1989, 44 years after the Horten Ho, 229 first lifted off a frozen German airfield, the United States Air Force officially unveiled the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber to the world. The moment photographs of the B-2 were released publicly, aviation historians and military analysts did not reach for their technical manuals first. They reached for their wartime archives. Because standing on that runway in Palmdale, California, is a shape that Reimar and Walter Horten would have recognized immediately. The same swept geometry, the same absence of vertical surfaces, the same fundamental philosophy of defeating radar not through electronic countermeasures, but through shape itself. Northrop Grumman, the company that built the B-2, has always been careful with its language on this subject. They acknowledge the Horten brothers' contribution to aviation history. They speak respectfully of the flying wing concept as a parallel evolution rather than a direct inheritance. But the engineers who have studied both aircraft side by side, who have measured the angles, analyzed the radar absorption principles, trace the aerodynamic mathematics, arrive at conclusions that are considerably less diplomatic. The Horten Ho 229 was not simply an ancestor of the B-2 Spirit. It was, in every meaningful technical sense, its blueprint. And this is where the story stops being purely about aviation. Because if a small team of brothers working in a converted workshop in wartime Germany, with no computers, no simulation software, no modern materials, science could independently arrive at stealth technology for decades before America officially invented it, then the question that demands to be asked is a deeply uncomfortable one. What else did they discover that we still haven't caught up to? Reimar Horten lived until 1994. He spent his post-war decades in Argentina, working quietly, speaking rarely, and almost never discussing the full extent of what had been developed and then destroyed in those final desperate weeks of 1945. In his later interviews, was always something behind his eyes, a particular kind of careful stillness. That suggested the documents that burned in Göttingen contained far more than the world has ever been officially told. Walter Horten died in 1998. His archives, passed to researchers after his death, revealed correspondence and technical sketches pointing toward aircraft concepts that even by modern standards would be considered extraordinarily advanced. The single surviving Ho 229 airframe rests today in climate-controlled preservation in Maryland. It is not on public display. It does not sit under bright museum lights where crowds can gather and photograph it. It waits in quiet storage. Partially assembled, partially understood. A machine that was built to change the outcome of a war. That arrived too late for the war. It was designed to win. And far too early for the world it was designed to inhabit. Germany lost the war. Of that, there is no question. But the aircraft they hid until the very end. The shape they tried to burn, scatter, and erase from history. It survived. It survived in archives. in blueprints carried inside human memory across oceans, in the geometry of a stealth bomber that flies today over the same skies where Allied radar once searched desperately for something it could not find. The most dangerous weapon Germany ever built was never fired in anger. It never needed to be. Because the most powerful thing about a weapon that is hidden is not what it destroys, it is what it becomes. Long after the war that created it is forgotten. This has been WW2 Ghost Wings. If this story reached something inside you, share it, subscribe, and remember the history they tried hardest to erase. Is always the history worth knowing?